Welcome to History to Snooze By. Before we begin, take a deep breath and let it out slowly. Rest your head, close your eyes, and allow yourself to drift gently into the past. Tonight's journey is a quiet one, a haunting one, into the fading echo of a world that once bustled with life, a world unaware of the shadow that was coming. Please consider liking and subscribing if you enjoy these calm explorations of forgotten history. Now, let us begin. Chapter 1: Before the Silence. Before the plague, the world hummed with ordinary life. It was the early 1340s, and across the great sprawl of Europe, the rhythms of daily life unfolded as they always had. Farmers tilled the damp spring soil beneath cloudy skies. In towns and villages, children chased chickens through muddy streets. The bells of churches rang out in steady tones, calling the faithful to morning mass. There was hardship, yes, always hunger in the lean months, always the fear of war or fire or poor harvests. But life went on, as it had for centuries. In the countryside, peasants bent beneath the weight of sacks filled with grain or turnips. The scent of smoke from hearth fires lingered in the cool morning air. Milk sloshed in wooden pails. The lowing of cows, the clatter of hooves on stone, the quiet rhythm of scythes slicing through grass, these were the sounds of the living world. In market squares, the din of barter and haggling echoed beneath timbered roofs. A fishwife shouted her prices. A baker dusted loaves with flour. Children darted between stalls, snatching apples when no one looked. Monks walked in pairs, their sandals slapping softly on worn cobblestones, robes swaying like waves of cloth. This world was not perfect. Sickness came and went, fevers, chills, coughs, rashes. Life was fragile, but familiar. People were born, they married, they aged, and they died. But they did so within the known bounds of life's cycle. Each death, though mourned, made sense. No one expected what was coming. Far to the east, beyond the edges of the known world, something stirred. Not a shadow with wings or fangs, but something smaller, quieter. Fleas nestled in the fur of rats. The rats, in turn, stowed away on ships, clambering up ropes, hiding in sacks of grain, their black eyes glinting in the dark. They carried something with them. Something unseen, but lethal. It slept in their blood, a bacterium, Yersinia pestis, and when it woke, it did not roar. It whispered. The first rumblings came in 1346. In the ports of the Black Sea, on the Crimean Peninsula, Genoese traders found themselves trapped by war. Outside the walls of the city of Kaffa, a Mongol army laid siege. But the attackers, too, were dying, not from arrows or swords, but from within. Bodies blackened, fevered, swollen. And in an act both grotesque and desperate, the Mongols flung their dead over the city walls, catapulting plague-ridden corpses into the streets of Kaffa. From there, it spread. Sailors fled. Ships launched in panic, sails catching wind with the urgency of fear. But they carried more than cargo. Below deck, in the hold, rats scurried. Fleas bit. Men coughed. And the death that began in the east now had a way westward, on waves and wind. Back in Europe, life went on unaware. In Paris, the cathedral bells rang over crowded streets. Pilgrims crossed stone bridges, rosaries clutched in hand. In the English countryside, men mended fences, unaware that across the sea, doom had already found its vessel. There were omens, though few noticed them for what they were. A comet was seen streaking across the sky, a silent arc of light against the velvet dark. Some whispered of bad luck. Others crossed themselves and muttered prayers. But still, life continued. Bread rose in ovens. Children laughed. The poor begged at monastery gates. No one knew they stood at the edge of a cliff. And then came the first dying ships. They entered the ports of Sicily and Genoa in 1347, sails sagging, decks eerily quiet. When dock workers climbed aboard, they found silence and corpses. Or worse, men still alive, but barely. Their bodies swollen, purple-black boils bubbling beneath their arms and groin. Eyes bloodshot, breath shallow, skin fevered and slick. The workers recoiled. But it was already too late. Rats fled the ships and vanished into alleys. Fleas leapt from fur to skin. And the death, the Black Death, began to spread. In the weeks that followed, reports began to emerge. A merchant's wife in Messina fell ill. A priest collapsed during Mass. The sick coughed blood, then fell into fevered comas. Boils burst. Limbs blackened. Entire households went quiet. Still, the scope of it was not yet understood. In Florence, artists painted frescoes. In Bruges, merchants weighed silver coins. In London, the court busied itself with politics and petty intrigue. The world was too large, too proud, too certain of itself to believe that death could spread like fire in dry fields. But it could. And it would. As 1347 turned toward winter, the first chill winds blew down from the mountains and over the rooftops of sleeping cities. Fires crackled in hearths. Blankets were pulled tight. People coughed and thought it was just the cold. They had no idea that something far colder had arrived, not the wind, but the shadow that follows. It would take months still for the panic to begin in earnest. Months before the roads filled with weeping families, before the bells rang out not for weddings, but for mass burials. Before the physicians donned their grotesque masks, shaped like beaks, stuffed with herbs to ward off invisible death. But already, the world had changed. Already, the rats were moving. Already, the fleas were biting. Already, the plague was waking. And Europe, still drowsy with the comfort of the familiar, had yet to realize that it stood on the threshold of one of the darkest chapters in human history. The silence before the scream is often the loudest. So sleep now, in this moment before the fire, before the panic, before the morning cloaks the sun. For in the next chapter, we open the gates and let the Black Death in. Chapter 2, The Plague Arrives. It began with ships. Not storms, nor wars, nor great armies. Just ships, small, creaking vessels with tattered sails, slipping quietly into Sicilian harbors like ghosts. It was October of 1347 when the first of them arrived in the port of Messina. A Genoese trading fleet, returning from the Black Sea, where plague had already begun its slow, invisible dance. The townspeople gathered along the docks to greet them, expecting spice and silk, tales from far-off lands. But the sailors who stepped off those boats were not men of commerce anymore. They were dying. Even before they disembarked, the stench rolled across the docks, a fetid mix of blood, sweat, rot, and something harder to name, the scent of decay still clinging to the living. Their eyes were sunken, their skin slick with fever. Beneath their arms and between their thighs, great swollen lumps, some as large as apples, pulsed black and purple against their flesh. Some men stumbled forward, delirious, mumbling prayers or gibberish. Others dropped where they stood, mouths frothing, breath rattling in their chests like wind through broken glass. The townspeople fled, screaming. But the damage was done. The rats had already escaped the holds. The fleas had already leapt. And the sickness was loose. Within days, the plague seeped into the narrow stone alleys of Messina like dark water through cracked earth. House by house, street by street, the fever spread. No one could say how. There was no wound, no weapon. Just sudden chills, then fire behind the eyes. Then came the swellings, the bleeding, the blackening of fingers, toes, lips. In some, death came within a day. In others, a slow unraveling over a week of pain and silence. Messina tried to close its gates. But it was too late. Ships fled the harbor, trying to escape the curse. But as they sailed, they brought it to Palermo, to Cagliari, to Naples. Each new port greeted them with curiosity, and within days, with funeral bells. Across the sea in Marseille, word began to spread. Whispers, carried on salt wind and prayer. A sickness in Sicily, a wrath of God, a curse from the east. Some scoffed. Some crossed themselves and offered coins to churches. But the ships kept coming. In the cramped quarters of every vessel, death clung to ropes and crates. It moved beneath deck, in the damp wood, in the vermin no one noticed. It hid in linens and straw, in barrels and bread. By the end of the year, plague had arrived in France. In Marseille, the cobbled streets filled with cries and coughing. Priests anointed the dying until they themselves collapsed. The market square emptied. Doors were marked with black crosses. Bonfires were lit in the hopes of purging the air. People began to talk of a miasma, a poisonous fog sent by heaven to punish the wicked. They burned herbs in iron pots and wore amulets of brass. They hung crushed flowers from their doorways. But no charm or prayer could hold it back. In Avignon, seat of the Pope himself, panic spread like wildfire. His Holiness retreated into isolation, surrounded by fire pits to cleanse the air. But outside his sanctuary, thousands perished. Funerals were abandoned. Coffins became rare. The dead were wrapped in sheets, then piled into carts. The carts rolled slowly, creaking, echoing through streets once filled with laughter. At every corner, a voice would cry, "Bring out your dead." The poor died first. Their homes, tight and airless, became death traps. Families collapsed in silence. Infants wailed until they too fell quiet. There was no time to mourn. Then the wealthy began to fall, the merchants, the scribes, the nobles. No one was immune. The plague asked no questions. It came for all, equal and indifferent. From Marseille, it traveled west into Spain. Barcelona,
Valencia,
Granada, then north again, into the heart of France. In the great city of Paris, the Seine ran cold and grey. The air grew still, and the coughing began. By spring of 1348, it had reached the Alps, creeping towards Switzerland and Germany. The rhythm of life began to change. Doors stayed closed. Churches rang no bells. Cities grew quiet. The laughter of children, once common, became rare. Instead, there were the sounds of weeping, of prayers whispered in hoarse voices, of the dragging of wheels on stone. But even in the darkness, there were those who moved, messengers, merchants, pilgrims. And wherever they went, the plague followed, tucked in the folds of fabric, nestled in animal fur, clinging like a shadow. At sea, ships still launched. Some knew what they carried. Others did not. Sailors died at sea and were buried in the waves. But the rats remained aboard, and they reached new harbors. Venice, Florence, Pisa, Italy, beautiful and bright in the spring sun, began to wither. In Venice, masks were donned, long-beaked, leather horrors stuffed with lavender and mint. Physicians walked among the sick, poking them with sticks. They bled them, purged them, covered their sores with vinegar-soaked cloth. None of it worked. In Florence, the paintings were left unfinished. The cathedrals emptied. Entire households locked their doors and waited in silence, and in vain. Sometimes, a family would vanish all at once. No sound, no cry, just a silence where once there was song. A closed window, a darkened hearth. Neighbors began to look at one another with fear. A cough in the street made people scatter. Friends turned away. Even loved ones avoided touch. Touch became the most feared act of all. Mothers abandoned their children. Husbands left wives. Priests stopped visiting the dying. Compassion thinned, worn down by exhaustion and dread. Humanity frayed at the edges. And still, the ships kept coming. In Pisa, they tried to burn the dockyards. In Genoa, they sent vessels back out to sea, sails torn, without food or water, crews left to rot in silence. It was mercy, they said, or survival. But death was not so easily turned away. Across the Mediterranean, across the rivers and coasts of Europe, it kept spreading. Faster now. Hungrier. It rode in the breath of men. It lingered in the threads of cloth. It sat beside the hearth and waited. In every port, in every town, the same questions echoed. What is this sickness? Why is it here? When will it end? No one had answers. Only the dead spoke, and they said nothing at all. By the end of 1348, tens of thousands had perished. The numbers meant little. It was not about counting anymore. It was about absence, the empty beds, the quiet doorways, the stillness. And this was only the beginning. Next, it would reach the heart of Europe. England waited, unknowing. And soon, the death ships would arrive. Chapter 3: The Port's Fall. The sea, once a source of trade, travel, and hope, had become a corridor of death. By the start of 1348, the plague crept along every coastline in southern Europe. It traveled by ship, by wind, by the unseen things that burrowed in straw and clung to fur. No longer a distant horror, it had become something local. Familiar. Feared. The ports, gateways to the world, became traps. In city after city, once bustling harbors fell quiet. Messina, Palermo, Genoa, all tried to seal themselves off, but too late. The disease had arrived before anyone knew it had a name. And now, as the plague spread beyond the coastal cities, panic began to bloom. In Venice, a city of canals and salt-laced breezes, officials moved quickly. They built barriers around infected neighborhoods, posted guards, and turned away ships whose crews showed signs of sickness. They even created floating isolation zones, ships anchored offshore, left to drift in silent quarantine. But the rats did not respect boundaries. They slipped into the city unnoticed, tails brushing across the marble floors of palaces and creeping along the damp wood of storehouses. On land, the fleas leapt to dogs, to cats, to humans. And the sickness settled in. Even behind locked gates, even among the wealthy and the careful, death found its way. In Florence, the government tried to organize responses. Public sanitation was improved. Fires were lit in the streets to cleanse the air. People carried sweet-smelling herbs, rosemary, thyme, and crushed rose petals, in little pouches. Some tied them to their wrists. Others held them constantly to their noses. The scent of lavender filled the churches, thick and cloying. It did not help. By mid-year, there were too many dead. Burial grounds overflowed. In some cities, they opened ancient tombs to make room. In others, they dug long trenches, deep and wide, and lowered in the bodies by the cartload. They came day and night, the carts. Wooden wheels clattered over cobblestones, pulled by thin horses or weary men. "Bring out your dead," they cried. And one by one, the doors opened. Wrapped in linen. Wrapped in nothing. The bodies were handed over in silence, or with the trembling grief of the newly broken. The gravediggers worked without pause. Some wept as they worked. Others hummed under their breath, a kind of madness creeping in like fog. The air grew heavy with rot. The flies thickened. Priests no longer performed rites. There were too many, and the priests themselves were dying. In Marseille, the bishop fled. In Valencia, the clergy who remained offered blessings from windows, waving crosses from a distance. Faith was stretched thin. Some saw the plague as divine punishment. Others believed it a test, a fire through which the soul must walk. Still others turned to darker thoughts. Whispers passed through taverns and alleyways, the idea that someone had caused this, that someone had poisoned the wells. And so the innocent were blamed. Foreigners, outcasts. The Jewish communities, in particular, faced violent hatred. In some cities, they were rounded up, tortured, killed. Entire neighborhoods were burned, not by the plague, but by human hands. The ports, once gateways to the world, had become crucibles of fear and rage. By the summer of 1348, the plague had reached every major trade hub from Lisbon to Constantinople. The Mediterranean glistened under a harsh sun, but its waters were no longer a path to prosperity. They carried death, rippling gently beneath the hulls of merchant ships. In coastal towns, silence settled. The taverns emptied. The fishmongers vanished. The cries of merchants gave way to the hollow echo of birds. The churches, once filled with incense and hymns, became places of whispered prayers and closed doors. In some, the pews were stacked with bodies. Whole families died within days of each other. A father fell sick and retreated to bed. Then the mother. Then the children. Sometimes only one remained, a child too young to understand, left crying in the dark for voices that would never return. And still, the ports tried to fight. Some banned all ships. Others posted watchmen to inspect vessels from a distance. Quarantine stations were built, isolated from the cities. The sick were sent there, left in straw huts under the sun. Some recovered. Most did not. One by one, the guards abandoned their posts. Fear eroded duty. Hunger, too. Food supplies dwindled as trade collapsed. Fields outside the cities grew over with weeds. The men who once tilled them were either dead, or too afraid to leave their homes. In the smaller fishing villages, entire populations vanished. Nets dried in piles where they had been left. Boats bobbed aimlessly at their moorings. Smoke no longer rose from chimneys. A traveler arriving months later might find only silence, overturned tables, rotting bread, a doll left in the street. Cats prowled the ruins. Dogs turned feral. And yet, even as the ports fell, the disease moved on. It had grown hungry. It had tasted the salt air, the cries of mothers, the cracking of earth as graves were dug. But it wanted more. It followed the rivers now, inland, upstream. The Rhône, the Loire, the Thames, up into France, across to Flanders, north to the Low Countries, and then to England. In the Channel, the sea darkened under grey skies. Clouds thickened. The wind turned cold. The first English ports saw the strange ships approaching, vessels from France, from Flanders. They docked carefully, if at all. And then, soon after, the first signs began. A merchant's apprentice in Dorset fell ill. Then a dock worker. Then a child. The English would not yet know the name of what had arrived. But it had arrived nonetheless. As the ports of Europe fell one by one, a tide of darkness crept inland, unstoppable and slow. Not a wave that crashes, but one that rises inch by inch, until all is drowned. The sea gave the world riches once. Now it gave it death. And the land was next. Chapter 4. Into the Towns. By the time the first leaves of autumn began to fall in 1348, the plague had crept beyond the ports. It moved inland now, along winding roads, over river crossings, and through the gates of towns nestled between hills and fields. It did not roar. It did not scream. It arrived like mist, settling softly on rooftops, creeping beneath doors, wrapping itself around chimney smoke. In the towns, life had always been predictable. A bell marked the morning. The baker lit his oven. The cobbler opened his shop. Chickens scratched in alleyways, and the cries of children echoed down cobbled streets. There was gossip by the well, merchants calling out from their stalls, and priests passing with folded hands and soft words. All of that began to fade. It began with a cough. One cough. Then two. Then a silence, where laughter used to be. In small villages and rural towns, places untouched by the bustle of harbours, the first cases came as a mystery. A travelling monk, pale and shaking. A merchant's wife, burning with fever. A shepherd, found collapsed in a field, his flock scattered and bleating. The sickness was sudden, violent, alien. At first, people called it the pestilence. Others said the foul air, or God's breath. Few understood what it was, but all felt it. The weight of it. The wrongness of it. It did not act like other illnesses. It did not pass gently. It tore through households in days. One child, then another. A father, then a neighbor. By the end of a week, entire streets were shuttered. By the end of a month, towns were unrecognizable. The signs were always the same. A high fever. Pain so deep it felt as though bones themselves were being twisted. Then came the swellings, bulbous, black boils that grew beneath the arms, in the groin, along the neck. They pulsed with heat. They bled. They stank. In many, they burst, weeping foul pus. In others, they never had the chance. The fever took them first. Some who fell ill screamed in agony. Others simply drifted away, their breath shallowing, eyes staring at things no one else could see. No one knew what to do. Physicians came, wearing long leather coats and strange beaked masks filled with herbs and spice. They carried sticks to poke the afflicted from a distance. They lit fires in the streets to drive out the bad air. They bled the sick, applied poultices, chanted prayers. But the death kept coming. No town was spared. In Avignon, in Toulouse, in Ghent and Bruges, the same pattern. First came denial, then fear, then despair. In every town, the church tried to answer the questions. Why us? Why now? But their words rang hollow. Too many priests had died. Too many prayers had gone unanswered. And so people turned to other beliefs. Flagellants began to march through the towns, barefoot men in tattered robes, chanting hymns and whipping themselves bloody in the streets, hoping their suffering would earn divine forgiveness for all. They wept as they marched, trailed by villagers who knelt in silence. Others turned to blame. Rumors spread like fire, that Jews had poisoned the wells, that foreigners had cursed the land, that witches had summoned darkness from the hills. In some towns, these rumors led to violence. Innocent people dragged into the streets. Homes burned. Entire communities erased. Fear made monsters of men. But most simply hid. Doors were bolted shut. Curtains drawn. Streets fell quiet. The fountains ran, but no one came to draw water. Markets stood still, goods rotting beneath cloth coverings. Mothers cradled sick children, watching helplessly. Fathers buried their wives in the garden. Elderly couples held hands as the fever took them. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. And yet the plague moved on. It did not linger. It did not rest. It flowed like water, always seeking what was untouched. Always hungry. By late 1348, it had reached into the very heart of Europe. In central France, once vibrant towns like Limoges and Clermont grew silent. Their roads cracked with neglect. Their windows stared blankly, like the eyes of the dying. In the German territories, towns braced for what they could not stop. Church bells rang constantly. Masses were held in fields, where the air was thought to be purer. People wore cloths soaked in vinegar. They burned sulfur in their homes. They hung crushed herbs from their rafters and wrote charms on their doors. Still, the sickness came. In the villages, the silence was perhaps worst of all. A place once full of song, the clatter of carts, the bleating of sheep, the laughter of children, now reduced to wind and flies. In some places, no one remained to bury the dead. Crows gathered in the fields. Wolves returned to the edge of the woods. There were no funerals, no wakes, only stillness. In towns where the death toll was worst, the survivors left. They wandered, dazed, in search of safety, traveling by foot across countryside as quiet as a tomb. Some were turned away from villages. No one wanted strangers. No one wanted risk. Hospitals overflowed. Churches locked their doors. Even those who opened their hearts at first grew cold with fear. They watched their neighbors die and stopped answering knocks. There were those who sang hymns as they passed from house to house, offering help. Some became known as the good hands, men and women who tended to the sick with soft voices and simple comfort. But even they fell, one by one, their kindness unable to shield them. And always, the carts returned. Bring out your dead. Even the children learned those words. By winter, there were towns without a single living soul. Just shuttered homes, collapsed roofs, and fields where wheat grew wild and unharvested. The plague did not just kill bodies. It unraveled the threads that bound communities together. It stripped away trust. It quieted voices. It replaced laughter with coughing, joy with dread, love with silence. And still, it had not yet finished. It had tasted the ports. It had drained the towns. And now, it turned its eyes toward the great cities. London waited. Paris trembled. The plague was coming, and it would not knock. Chapter 5, England's Turn. Across the cold waters of the English Channel, the wind carried more than salt and spray. By the end of 1348, the Black Death had reached the shores of England. It did not arrive with fanfare or fury. It came on the backs of ships, just as it had elsewhere, silent, cloaked in mist, hiding among sacks of wool and barrels of wine. Beneath the boards, the rats stirred. On their backs, the fleas feasted. The town of Melcombe Regis in Dorset was among the first to feel it. A ship docked quietly. No cries for help. No alarm. Just weary sailors, some pale and swaying, others already gone cold. The townsfolk watched with curiosity at first. Then suspicion. Then fear. Within days, the sickness began. A boy fell ill, fevered and pale, his breath shallow, his skin hot to the touch. Then his sister. Then their father. By week's end, their home was boarded shut, and the cart rolled by to collect what remained. Word travelled slowly inland, carried by messengers, by merchants, by whispers at inns and monasteries. The pestilence had crossed the sea. In the halls of London, the news was met with disbelief. Illness was common. Sickness, after all, had always been part of life. But this was different. Soon, disbelief gave way to dread. The great city of London, heart of the kingdom, was unprepared. Its narrow streets were already crowded, its alleys dark and damp. Houses leaned into one another like old men whispering secrets. The Thames flowed sluggish and grey, carrying waste and rot. When the plague reached the city, it spread like fire on dry straw. The first signs were familiar by now: the sudden fever, the pain beneath the arms, the swelling. Black blotches appeared on the skin. Vomiting followed. Then silence. One by one, the households dimmed. Curtains drawn. Doors shut tight. But nothing could hold the sickness out. The cemeteries began to fill. The priests could not keep up. Mass graves were dug wide and deep, and filled layer by layer. Shrouded bodies laid down in silence, stacked like firewood, dusted with lime. At first, the rich fled. They packed carriages and galloped into the countryside, believing the fresh air would protect them. Some made it far enough to avoid the worst. Others carried the sickness with them, spreading it to villages, to manors, to places that had been untouched. There was no true refuge. No border the plague would not cross. No gate it would not pass. In Oxford, scholars fell ill mid-lecture. In Cambridge, the libraries grew still. Monasteries once filled with chants and candlelight were reduced to silence, their monks laid side by side in quiet rows. In the countryside, it was slower, but just as cruel. The plague travelled by road and by foot, following the paths of traders and peddlers. It came to cottages nestled among hedgerows, to shepherds watching their flocks beneath grey skies. Families who had never seen a city now faced the same fate as those in London. Villages emptied. Some were abandoned forever. Churches stood with doors ajar, their bells still. In the graveyards, fresh mounds rose like waves. The earth, once a cradle, had become a moor. The symptoms were terrifying. People spoke of the great buboes, black swellings that throbbed and burst. Some tried to drain them with knives. Others rubbed them with onion and vinegar, or prayed over them with shaking hands. Nothing worked. The afflicted burned with fever. Some went blind. Others delirious, ranting, weeping, clawing at the air. Some wandered the streets naked, consumed by madness. Others died in their beds, clutching rosaries or letters never sent. And always, the same ending. Silence. Even the king, Edward III, was not untouched by grief. His own daughter, Princess Joan, fell ill and died while travelling to Spain, her journey never completed. Her death echoed through the royal court, a reminder that no name, no title, no wealth could shield against the plague. In the towns, people turned to superstition. They nailed herbs above their doors. They sang psalms in the streets. Some believed in magic, others in sin. They fasted, wept, confessed. Some gave away everything they owned, walking barefoot to distant shrines in the hope of redemption. Still, the sickness came. In Norwich, they lit great fires in the streets to cleanse the air. In York, the bells rang until the ropes snapped. In Bristol, the cartmen could no longer keep up. Bodies were left at crossroads, marked only with stones. The economy faltered. Markets collapsed. Crops withered in the field, for there were too few hands to harvest them. Sheep wandered untended. Cattle lowed in empty barns. And always, the numbers climbed. Some chroniclers say that by the time the plague finished its first sweep through England, nearly half the population had vanished. But numbers are dry things. What truly lingered was the absence. The empty chairs by the hearth. The shuttered shop with no goodbye. The field once bright with laughter, now overgrown with weeds. The sense that something sacred had been broken. By the time the plague reached Scotland and Ireland, it came on tired legs. The fleas and rats had done their work. Death had a rhythm now, a routine, as familiar as the dawn. And yet, even in its fury, life clung on. There were those who survived. Those who nursed the sick and did not fall ill. Those who buried their neighbors and returned to light the fire each morning. They did not sing songs of triumph. They did not boast. They simply endured. As the year turned to 1349, England remained, but changed. A nation wrapped in mourning. A land shadowed by questions. And across the sea, the mainland still burned. The plague had not finished its work. It still had cities to visit, souls to collect, and the sound of its passing was still the silence it left behind. Chapter 6: The Cities Rot. At first, the cities believed they could endure. They were strong, walled, crowded with knowledge and guarded by faith. Their churches were tall, their libraries vast. Their towers cast long shadows over rivers that had run since the time of kings. But the Black Death did not care for stones or titles. It came all the same. By 1349, the plague had reached the great cities of Europe, and the rot began. In Paris, the air grew thick with ash and incense. The priests lit candles in every cathedral, but their light did little to hold back the darkness. The Seine flowed silently past shuttered buildings, its waters murky with refuse and death. The streets, once loud with students, merchants, and laughter, fell quiet. The stench of decay hung over every quarter. Corpses piled in courtyards. Entire convents vanished. Monks dug trenches behind abbeys, burying their brothers by the dozen. Funeral chants blurred into coughs. The churches rang no bells, for there were none left to ring them. The doctors, draped in their strange, bird-like masks, moved in small circles, their leather coats rustling like wings, their boots blackened with filth. They prescribed smoke and vinegar. They offered blessings and leeches. They watched their patients die, one after another. Paris bled into chaos. Order collapsed like a crumbling wall. Officials fled. Schools closed. Markets were deserted. The dead were dumped into carts, covered in sheets, then forgotten. The plague knew no class, no virtue, no escape. And Paris was not alone. To the east, the great cities of the Holy Roman Empire began to fall. In Cologne, where the great cathedral spires reached toward heaven, the air was thick with incense and dread. Worshippers gathered in droves, hoping prayer might save them. But the pews emptied as fast as they filled. Priests coughed mid-sermon, and monks were found lifeless on cold stone floors. Civic leaders tried to impose order. They set curfews, burned scented woods in public squares, declared fasts and festivals of repentance. But the sickness moved faster. No law could stop it. No ritual could change its course. In the marketplaces, apples rotted on wooden stalls. Loaves of bread lay untouched, covered in flies. Coins changed hands with gloved fingers. Eye contact became a thing of fear. A sneeze could clear a room. A cough could cost a man his life. Soon, the graveyards filled. Then the gardens. Then the city squares. They dug wide pits, dark mouths in the earth, and lowered bodies by the dozen. The lime hissed as it touched the skin. The dirt was shoveled over quickly, without prayer or marker. Just names whispered by those left behind, if anyone was left at all. The people turned to superstition. They rang bells in the streets, hung charms from their necks, sang hymns and whipped themselves until their backs bled. Some claimed visions. Others offered gold to saints carved in stone. But gold did not shine in the eyes of the dying. It was no shield. From Florence to Prague, the rot spread, not just of flesh, but of hope. The cities grew dim, not because the sun no longer shone, but because the people no longer looked up. In Venice, the gondolas drifted aimlessly, their passengers dead or dying. In Bruges, the artists laid down their brushes. Paint dried on unfinished canvases, hands forever outstretched, mouths never completed. In Avignon, the papal court burned aromatic woods by the ton, hoping to cleanse the air. The Pope surrounded himself with walls of flame, sitting in isolation, as if fire could halt death. It could not. The rot was not just physical. It was moral, spiritual, social. Families collapsed inward. Fathers abandoned children. Mothers turned their faces from the cries of the sick. What good was love? People wondered, if it meant your own death. There were those who gave in to despair. They drank. They danced. They gambled in empty courtyards, Laughter twisted into something hollow and desperate. Some married strangers. Others confessed sins they had long buried. The line between survival and surrender blurred. And always, the silence deepened. At night, the cities breathed like something ill. The wind moved through broken windows, rustling the cloth of the dead. Rats scurried in silence. Dogs howled into the dark. The moon shone down on streets that once pulsed with life, now still as tombs. It was not just people who died. Ideas died. Trust died. The illusion of safety, of control, withered and turned to dust. In some cities, no records remain. No names, no dates. Only the echo of what once was. They were swallowed whole. And yet, within the rot, a few lights still flickered. A nun who fed the sick, despite her trembling hands. A gravedigger who whispered a prayer over each soul. A child who sang to herself in an empty house. These moments, small, fragile, glowed like coals in the ashes. But the cities had fallen, and the plague had not yet finished its journey. It turned its gaze now toward the countryside, toward the fields, toward the villages barely marked on maps, where no bells tolled and no healers came. It would visit them too. The rot was not confined by walls. It followed breath. Chapter 7. Villages Vanish. There were no bells in the villages, no towers to ring them, no walls to mark their borders, just thatched roofs, low stone fences, and winding lanes where sheep wandered, and chickens clucked beneath the sun. These were quiet places. Small communities that dotted the European countryside like scattered seeds, nestled in valleys, tucked behind hills, perched beside rivers. Their names were barely known beyond the next parish. Their stories were unwritten, passed mouth to mouth by firelight. And when the plague came, they vanished just as quietly. The first sign was absence. A smoke trail no longer rising from a chimney. A field left unplowed. A well bucket untouched, swaying in the wind. Some villages were struck like lightning. A traveler passed through, perhaps coughing, perhaps pale, and days later, the fevers began. Others received the plague from within, a son returning from the market, a priest come to visit a dying friend. The result was the same. One by one, the homes fell silent. There were no doctors here. No scholars, no masked physicians or wagons of burning herbs. Only mothers, kneeling beside fevered children. Only brothers carrying their sisters to shallow graves dug by hand. Only prayer, raw and whispered, rising into a sky that gave no answer. In the countryside, death was slower, but more complete. There were no records kept. No names carved in stone. Entire families were lost, their homes overtaken by ivy and dust. Doors swung open in the wind. Loaves of bread lay molding on wooden tables. Toys scattered on dirt floors. Cats curled beside bodies that would never stir again. The animals, too, suffered. Cows wandered from their stalls, lowing with hunger. Pigs rooted through abandoned gardens. Sheep drifted across overgrown meadows, their fleece heavy with thorns. In some places, wild dogs took over. In others, wolves came down from the hills, reclaiming the silence. Villages became ghostly echoes, outlines of life, half erased. In the forests of central France, in the hills of Bohemia, in the glens of Scotland, entire settlements disappeared. Even the paths that once led to them were swallowed by weeds. It was said that travelers sometimes came upon these places, months later. A circle of stones where a fire had once burned. A child's shoe in the mud. A rusted pot filled with rainwater. But no voices. No warmth. Just the wind moving through doorways that led nowhere. Some villagers tried to flee. They packed what little they had, a loaf, a cross, a candle, and left under cover of night. They traveled by foot, hoping to find untouched ground. But they were often turned away. No one wanted strangers. No one wanted the risk. Others chose to stay. They closed their shutters. They sealed their doors with ash and prayer. They hung holy symbols above their thresholds. Some survived. Most did not. The lucky ones were buried by loved ones. The rest were left where they fell. Over time, nature reclaimed them. Vines crept up walls. Moss softened sharp stones. Trees grew where kitchens had once stood. And the birds returned, not in mourning, but in difference. Their songs filled the empty lanes, unaware of the silence beneath their feet. It was in the villages that the plague revealed its truest cruelty. Not in the numbers, but in the stillness. In the absence of voices. In the way the sun rose each morning over a world with fewer eyes to see it. The church sent no messengers. Kings heard no cries. No bells rang for these souls. And so they vanished, not in a blaze, but like embers in the wind. Yet even here, in the most forgotten places, there were glimmers of life. A girl who survived, living on berries and rainwater, her dress torn and face streaked with ash. A wandering friar who tended to the sick until he too could walk no more, finally resting beneath an old oak tree. A farmer who returned home after many weeks away, finding only silence, and yet stayed, planting again, one seed at a time. These stories were few, flickering like candle flames in the dark. But they mattered, because they were the proof that not all had ended. That somewhere, amid the rot and silence, breath still rose and fell. That life, even bruised and trembling, still held on. But the villages, hundreds of them, were gone. Their names forgotten. Their fields wild. Their fires cold. And the plague moved on. It followed the rivers now. It climbed the mountain roads. It crept toward the last places it had yet to visit. The death had not yet spoken its final word. The silence had not yet reached its deepest pitch. There were still hearts left to break. Still voices left to fall quiet. The Black Death would not stop until the whole of the land had tasted it. And the world would never be the same. Chapter 8. The Sounds of Silence. First came the coughing. Then the prayers. Then the weeping. And then, nothing at all. The plague did not just still bodies. It stilled the very air. It quieted the laughter of children, the songs of taverns, the hammering of forges. Across Europe, a new silence settled, deep, wide, and strange. It was not the peace of rest. It was the quiet of a world that had forgotten how to speak. In the cities, the noise had once been endless. Street hawkers shouting their wares. Bakers clanging trays. Priests chanting from their pulpits. The slap of sandals on cobblestone. The ringing of coins. All of it gone. What remained were smaller sounds. Slower sounds. The shuffle of feet outside a shuttered home. The distant toll of a church bell, one ring for each soul lost, until the bell itself cracked from overuse and was left to hang, still and rusted. The creak of a cart's wooden wheels as it rolled past empty alleyways, its driver silent, its cargo still. These were the sounds of a dying world. In the early mornings, before the sun burned the mist away, you could hear the wind brushing over rooftops and through cracked windows. It whispered through the rafters of homes once filled with warmth. It whistled beneath church doors. It carried the scent of ash and lavender and the sickly sweetness of decay. Sometimes, you might hear voices, but never for long. A mother murmuring to her child, though the child no longer stirred. A priest reciting prayers to a row of empty pews. A child singing softly to herself in an attic room, surrounded by silence. And always, the footsteps. lonely, echoing, a figure in the distance, a shadow slipping through the fog. And then, nothing. The great cathedrals, once echoing with choirs, now rang with birdsong and the rustle of vermin. In some, crows nested in rafters. In others, wild dogs trotted down the nave, their claws tapping gently on stone. The libraries grew still. The forges went cold. The taverns stood untouched, mugs still on tables, chairs overturned, as if laughter had simply walked out and never returned. In the countryside, the quiet was deeper still. Fields lay fallow. Wheat grew wild and unharvested, swaying in the breeze like uncombed hair. Cows lowed in distant pastures, but no hands came to milk them. Sheep huddled against one another at dusk, unshorn and uncounted. In the distance, birds sang their usual songs, but with no ears to hear them, they felt like echoes of a world that no longer responded. There were no wedding bells, no calls to feast, only the occasional toll of a death bell, swung by a hand that trembled more with grief than strength. And there was another sound, softer than the others, yet unmistakable. The sound of digging. Grave after grave, carved into the soil by men too tired to speak. The shovel's blade sinking with a dull crunch. The drag of linen across dry earth. The thud of soil on wood. It was a rhythm repeated across the continent. And when the digging stopped, so did the last sound of labor. Even mourning became muted. In the early days, people cried openly. They gathered in circles, lit candles, whispered blessings. But as the deaths multiplied, the tears dried. Faces grew blank, eyes distant. The sorrow had become too large, too constant, to be named. Some turned inward. Some went mad. Others simply stopped. Stopped speaking. Stopped eating. Stopped living before their bodies had followed. The plague took voices as surely as it took breath. In this silence, even nature seemed hesitant. The forests crept in at the edges of old roads, but slowly, cautiously, as though uncertain whether it was allowed. The rivers flowed, but more sluggishly. The rain fell in soft mists, not storms, as if the heavens themselves whispered now, afraid to raise their voice. And then, occasionally, there would come a burst of sound. The screech of a bird startled from a windowsill. The crash of a door swinging loose on its hinges in the wind. The shatter of a jug knocked from a table by a stray animal. These sounds startled. They seemed too loud, too sharp, reminders that something still moved in a world that felt long since stopped. But mostly, it was quiet. So quiet that one could hear their own breath, their own heartbeat, the creak of their joints, the rustle of their own sleeve. People spoke in hushed tones, if they spoke at all. They feared that raising their voices might draw death's attention. And so they whispered. To their saints. To the dead. To themselves. The world, for a time, became a hushed cathedral. No matter where you went, from the spires of Cologne to the glens of Scotland, from the hills of Tuscany to the foggy fields of Kent, the air hung heavy. And in that air lived a silence that could not be measured. A silence built from loss, from fear, from awe. And deep within that silence, something stirred, not death, but memory. Because even as the noise vanished, the knowing remained. The stories, the faces, the weight of a world now paused. One day, the voices would return. The bells would ring. The laughter would rise. But not yet. Now, the world listened. To the echo of footsteps. To the breath of the wind. To the sound of silence. Chapter 9. Flagellants and Fear. In the darkest corners of the plague years, fear began to change. At first, it had been quiet, the kind of fear that lives behind the eyes, that twists in the gut, that stirs in the dark before sleep. It had crept in slowly, alongside the sickness. A whisper, a worry, a bad dream, half remembered. But as the death toll rose, and as answers failed to come, that quiet fear twisted into something louder, stranger. Something that moved. Something that bled. They were called flagellants. They came from distant towns and unknown places, walking barefoot through mud and frost, clothed in rough wool, cloaks dark with old blood. At their waist, they carried ropes. In their hands, they held whips. Across their shoulders, red, raw, broken, were the marks of penance. They marched through the villages in long, slow processions. They sang hymns, low and sorrowful. They cried out prayers in Latin, half understood even by those who spoke them. They wailed as they struck their backs with rhythmic fury, once, twice, 3 times, until the sound of leather hitting skin was as familiar as the tolling of death bells. People watched from their doorways, eyes wide. Some wept. Some crossed themselves. Some fell to their knees. For in those days, when even the priests could no longer explain the horrors, when the doctors had fallen silent, when the laws had crumbled, the flagellants offered a new answer. We suffer, so that God might show mercy. They believed the plague was punishment, not from chance or nature, but from the heavens themselves. They saw the sickness as a judgment, a wrath born of sin, a divine fire meant to purify a wicked world. And so they wandered, punishing themselves in the open, 33 days of marching, one for each year of Christ's life. They refused coin. They refused comfort. They sang as they bled, as their wounds opened and darkened and wept beneath linen shirts. They became both prophets and warnings. In some towns, they were welcomed with awe. People lined the roads to watch them pass, touching their robes, asking for blessings. Some joined them, throwing down their belongings and walking barefoot into the unknown. Mothers offered them food. Children mimicked their chants. In those places, for a while, the fear felt useful, like something that could be named, shaped, shared. But in other places, it turned darker. The flagellants did not always bring comfort. They brought suspicion, accusation, fire. As their numbers grew, so did their fury. They spoke not just of repentance, but of vengeance. They blamed the wealthy, the clergy, the outsiders. They pointed fingers at Jews, at lepers, at travelers. They claimed visions. They shouted of betrayal. Some claimed they could smell sin, see it in the faces of strangers. And in towns where panic had already taken root, the arrival of the flagellants was like a spark on dry grass. Some churches barred their doors against them. Some towns tried to turn them away. But others let them in. And what followed was often chaos. Jewish communities, already living under suspicion, were among the first to suffer. Rumors spread that they had poisoned the wells, that they had summoned the plague with rituals, that they were immune. None of it was true. But truth no longer mattered. In Mainz, in Strasbourg, in Cologne, mobs formed. Synagogues were burned. Families were dragged into the streets. Entire communities were slaughtered. Not by plague, but by fear. The church, slow to respond, eventually condemned the flagellants. The Pope issued warnings. Bishops closed their doors. But by then, the movement had spread too far. They marched across Germany, into the Low Countries, through Switzerland, into Poland. Everywhere they went, they brought a strange kind of order, a rhythm of suffering, a spectacle of pain, a visible, audible answer to the invisible death. And yet, for all their blood and all their cries, the plague did not stop. The whip did not save them. Many flagellants died anyway, fevered and coughing, their backs still bleeding, their prayers still rising into the cold night sky. Others disappeared, wandering into forests, never to be seen again. And still, fear found new forms. In the cities, people turned to relics, bones of saints, scraps of cloth said to be touched by the Virgin, drops of water from sacred springs. Merchants sold them at inflated prices. Families pawned heirlooms to buy them. They placed the relics above beds, hung them from rafters, sewed them into clothes. They whispered prayers over them, over and over, until their voices cracked and their hands trembled. And still, the coughing came. In the countryside, old folk tales returned. Some said the plague was a dark spirit, walking the land in a long black cloak, visiting door by door with a lantern in hand. Some claimed to see her in the fields at dusk. Others said she rode the wind. Children were taught to be still when the wind changed, not to whistle, not to speak, lest they draw her gaze. In the mountains, some spoke of witches, women who danced with devils, who summoned rats, who turned herbs into curses. And so old women were dragged from their homes, accused, beaten, sometimes burned. There was no sense to it, no order, only fear, dressed in whatever clothes the moment provided. Even the educated were not immune. Scholars wrote frantic treatises, trying to explain the plague. Some blamed the stars, the alignment of Saturn and Jupiter. Others blamed earthquakes, or stagnant air, or the sins of specific cities. They studied the swellings, the fevers, the patterns of death. They drew diagrams. They wrote until their hands cramped. And then they, too, fell ill. And the parchment was stained with ink and sweat. And silence took them as well. In this time, fear was a language spoken fluently by all. It shaped the way people walked, the way they prayed, the way they breathed. Some held garlic in their mouths at all times. Others refused to speak to strangers. Some didn't leave their homes for months, living on stale bread and melted snow. Some walked into forests and never came back. Some danced in the streets, naked and laughing, desperate to feel anything but dread. And still, the death came. It did not tire. It did not turn aside. And so, fear settled into the bones. It became a part of the landscape, a shadow at the edge of every candle flame, a cold hand on the back of every neck, a silence beneath every conversation. It was in the way people looked at one another, suspicious, cautious, distant. It was in the way they no longer touched. No embraces, no kisses on the cheek, no holding hands. Even love began to fray. Some said the plague would end if the people repented enough. Others said it would never end, that the world itself was sick, and this was its slow death. Still others stopped caring. They ate. They drank. They gave themselves to pleasures, laughing as the world burned. But beneath it all was fear. The kind that does not shout. The kind that does not sleep. The kind that sits beside you at the fire and never leaves. Chapter 10: Scapegoats and Cruelty. When fear lingers long enough, it changes. It sharpens. It looks for answers where there are none, and when it finds none, it creates them. By the second year of the plague, fear had soaked into every corner of Europe. It hung in the air heavier than incense, thicker than fog. It filled the churches, the markets, the fields. And in its endless grip, suspicion took root. The sickness, people began to say, could not be random. It was too cruel, too widespread, too unnatural. Surely someone must have caused it. Surely there must be blame. And so began one of the darkest patterns of the Black Death, not just the death of bodies, but the death of reason, of mercy, of neighborly trust. It began with whispers. In Strasbourg, people spoke of poisoned wells. In Basel, they whispered of hidden scrolls and secret gatherings. In Bern and Cologne, rumors spread that certain people had made pacts with evil, had cursed the land, had summoned the plague with wicked rites. The fingers pointed first to those already marked by difference: the outsiders, the wanderers, the poor. But most often, they pointed to the Jews. Across medieval Europe, Jewish communities had long lived in the margins, tolerated in times of stability, distrusted in times of stress. And now, as the plague gnawed through every city and farm and monastery, suspicion turned to rage. People asked why some Jewish quarters had lower death tolls, not realizing that many were walled, cleaner, more isolated. People found that Jewish wells tasted different, not knowing that Jewish law required covering them, protecting them from contamination. The truth didn't matter. The fear had already decided. In the early months of 1349, a letter circulated through parts of Germany and France. It claimed that Jews, under orders from a distant cabal, were poisoning wells in Christian towns. The letter was unsigned. The evidence, absent. The claims, wild and impossible. But people were desperate. And desperate people cling to certainty, even if it's cruel, even if it kills. The first massacres came in Savoy, then Toulouse, then Barcelona, Mainz, and Erfurt. In each, the pattern was chillingly similar. A crowd would gather, sometimes led by officials, sometimes by churchmen, sometimes just by mobs with torches and trembling voices. They would storm into the Jewish quarter, breaking down doors, shouting, accusing. Entire families would be dragged into the street. Some were killed where they stood. Others were thrown into rivers. In some towns, the entire Jewish community was herded into a synagogue, which was then locked and set ablaze. They died praying. They died holding their children. In Strasbourg, over 2,000 Jews were burned alive in a single day, February 14, 1349. They had been promised protection. That promise was broken. The bishop turned his face. The magistrates stood aside. The crowd danced as the flames rose. In Basel, the Jewish population was driven to a wooden house built on an island in the Rhine. The house was locked, then burned. The ashes scattered into the river. In Cologne, they fled, those who could. Some hid with sympathetic neighbors. Some vanished into the forests. Some tried to convert, hoping to be spared. But many were still hunted. This cruelty was not spontaneous. It was allowed. It was encouraged. Civic leaders passed laws seizing Jewish property after executions. Debts owed to Jewish moneylenders were erased upon their death. It became profitable to blame them. Fear had become a currency, and cruelty a means of profit. Not all participated. There were those who hid their neighbors, at great personal risk. Priests who spoke against the mobs. Bishops who tried, and failed, to stop the madness. But they were few. Most stayed silent. Some cheered. And the plague continued. It did not pause when the wells ran red. It did not lift when the last synagogue fell to ash. Because the disease had never been in the water. It had been in the fleas, in the rats, in the air, in the fabric of clothes and the cracks in the streets. But people could not punish rats. They could not see fleas. And so they punished each other. The Jews were not the only victims. In some towns, lepers were accused of spreading the disease by touch. Their skin was different. Their faces marked. They became objects of terror. Dozens were drowned. Others burned. Strangers were feared, especially those who looked or spoke differently. Women, too, became targets. In regions where witchcraft was still whispered of, old women were dragged from their cottages, accused of casting spells or summoning illness. Their herbs, once used to soothe and heal, became signs of guilt. They were beaten, drowned, hung. In one Flemish village, A midwife was accused of bringing death by cursing a newborn. She was tied to a post and left for 3 days without food or water. She confessed to anything they asked. And still, they did not spare her. Even animals were not safe. In parts of France and England, people slaughtered cats, believing they carried the plague, unaware that by doing so, they unleashed even more rats into the streets. In their effort to stop the disease, they helped it spread. Cruelty became a ritual, a twisted form of control. If the plague could not be understood, then at least someone could be blamed. If it could not be stopped, then at least a punishment could be carried out. It made people feel less helpless. And so, death walked in 2 forms. One with fever and boils. The other with ropes and knives. In both, the outcome was silence. In both, the world darkened. There were towns where entire neighborhoods were emptied, not by plague, but by execution. The blackened ruins of Jewish quarters dotted Europe like bruises on the land. The once sung prayers fell still. The once shared bread turned to ash. And the memories, for many, were buried alongside the dead, not honored, not spoken of, not mourned. Even now, centuries later, some of those names are unknown. Some of those communities were never rebuilt. Some of those languages were never spoken again. It is easy to think that tragedy brings people together. Sometimes it does. But the Black Death revealed another truth, that fear, when left to grow without guidance or grace, can devour kindness. That panic, when fed by superstition and power, becomes a weapon. That the line between survival and savagery is sometimes as thin as a whisper. And yet, amid the cruelty, some lights still flickered. There were those who refused to point fingers, who chose to protect, who took in the hunted, who offered bread to the exiled, who dared to see humanity even in a world slipping into madness. Their names, too, have often been forgotten. But their mercy mattered. In the long, dark corridors of plague, even the smallest acts of kindness glowed like candles. A hidden meal, a door left open, a whispered prayer over a stranger. These were not loud. They did not stop the plague, but they softened it. They reminded the world that compassion, though fragile, still lived. Even as scapegoats were hunted. Even as cruelty walked the streets. Even as fear became blood. Some still chose love. Chapter 11. The Doctors and Their Masks. They came in silence, cloaked in black. From a distance, they looked like crows, hunched figures, wrapped in leather, their faces long and beaked, their eyes hidden behind circles of dark glass. Children called them ghosts. The dying called them angels. And some called them death itself. They were the plague doctors. In a time when nothing made sense, when priests had fallen and kings could not stop the dying, the plague doctors walked the streets like strange, somber shadows. Their presence meant only one thing: the sickness had arrived. And yet, they came to help. Or, at least, they tried. Medicine in the 14th century was a patchwork of knowledge and guesswork, part tradition, part superstition, and part divine hope. The idea of infection as we understand it did not yet exist. Germs were unknown. The body, as most saw it, was ruled by humors, 4 fluids that had to be kept in balance: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If one sickened, it meant the humors had shifted. They had curdled, or grown hot, or risen to the head. And so the doctors came with leeches, with knives, with herbs, with charts of the stars. They tried, but the plague did not listen. Still, the masks. Always the masks. Shaped like a bird's beak, they jutted out from the face by several inches, filled with dried flowers, herbs, and vinegar-soaked sponges. Lavender, mint, camphor, cloves. anything to purify the air. The beak was more than a costume. It was a barrier, meant to keep out the invisible poisons that people believed floated on the wind, the so-called miasma, or bad air. They thought it was this foul vapor, rising from graves, from the sick, from the city itself, that brought the disease. The herbs inside were meant to cleanse that air, to protect, to preserve. But they did not work. The masks hid the doctors' faces, turning them into voiceless things, watchers, recorders, mourners. Behind the mask, each one was simply a man. Sometimes a real physician. Sometimes just someone brave enough, or desperate enough, to put on the robes and walk among the dying. Their outfits were made to cover every inch of skin. Leather gloves, a long, waxed coat, boots pulled high. They carried canes, not just to walk, but to keep the sick at arm's length. With them, they lifted sheets, prodded sores, cleared paths. Sometimes they tapped a shoulder or pointed to a body that needed collecting. They spoke little. The masks muffled sound. And in the presence of so much death, what was there to say? They entered homes that no one else dared to approach. Entire households lay in silence, some alive but fevered, others already still. The doctor moved from room to room, marking the door as infected, noting names, sometimes administering mixtures or bleeding. The bleeding, though, rarely helped. It was based on an old idea that removing bad blood could restore balance. But more often, it weakened the patient further. So they turned to herbs. Boiled in water, burned in fire pits, rubbed on skin. A mixture of onion and honey was common. Some made poultices of fig and butter. Others crushed emeralds, believing the powder could heal. There were cures that involved bathing in urine, or drinking vinegar, or applying toads to the swellings. Each remedy was offered with hope. Each failed. When that happened, the doctors could only record the death, cross another name from the list, and move on. They kept ledgers. Thick books, bound in leather, filled with names, ages, symptoms, dates. They logged how long the patient survived. Whether the swellings appeared in the neck or groin. Whether bleeding preceded death, or fever, or madness. These records became, in time, some of the only detailed accounts of the plague's toll. But at the time, they were mostly lists of the lost. Some cities hired plague doctors as official roles. Venice, Florence, Avignon. They were paid by the state, not by patients, so that all could be treated, regardless of class or coin. But this did not make them rich. Few wanted the job. Many died doing it. Those who lived often became pariahs, feared as carriers of the disease. There are stories of doctors who were locked out of their homes, shunned by their neighbors, who lived alone, ate in silence, spoke to no one. Some grew hardened, detached. They spoke clinically of the boils, of how the flesh blackened, of how long the blood took to clot. Others grew quiet, gentle, as if their words might break the world further. There were moments of tenderness, even amid the horror. A doctor holding a child's hand through gloved fingers. A whispered prayer over a dying man. A note left behind for a grieving widow, explaining that her husband had not suffered long. Sometimes, their presence brought comfort. Other times, it brought fear. When people saw the mask, they closed their shutters. They lit more candles. They whispered to the saints. Because where the doctor walked, death was already waiting. And still, they walked. Day after day. Week after week. From house to house. From bed to bed. They were not immune. Many caught the plague despite their masks. The sickness clung to their coats. It soaked into their gloves. It breathed through the glass lenses and the thin cloth beneath the beak. Some were found collapsed in alleyways, their books still open in one hand. Others died in their sleep, their masks resting beside their beds. And still, the role continued. Because someone had to try. Someone had to witness. In monasteries, healers did their best. They mixed tonics from ancient recipes, valerian, wormwood, sage. They boiled water with rosemary and set it beside the sick. They sang hymns as they worked. They anointed foreheads with oil. They wrapped the dead gently, as if the soul still lingered close. In villages, it was often the women who took up the healer's work. Mothers, wives, herbalists. They brought warm broth, cold cloth, quiet hands. They risked their lives for kindness. Some survived. Many did not. But their work mattered. Because in a world collapsing, a hand on the shoulder, a wet rag on a fevered brow, a few drops of tea into cracked lips, these things became sacred. Even when death followed. Especially when it did. The doctors, those strange, masked crows, came to symbolize the plague itself. In art. In memory. In the stories whispered long after the dying had ceased. They became ghosts of their own. Not demons. Not saints. Just men who walked where others would not. And tried. And failed. And still, tried again. Centuries later, their image endures. The long beak. The dark coat. The hidden eyes. A symbol of death. A symbol of duty. A symbol of the strange, painful beauty of trying to help in a world that cannot be saved. They did not cure the plague. They did not stop the dying. But they bore witness. They carried names. They crossed thresholds where no one else dared to go. And in that, perhaps, they found purpose. In that, perhaps, they gave something precious. Presence. When everything else had vanished. Chapter 12. Children of the Plague. They were the smallest victims. The quietest. The least understood. They were the children, the sons and daughters of a world unraveling, caught in a storm they could not name, in a silence they did not create. They lived in homes where the fire went out and never returned. They slept in beds that became too big, too quiet, too cold. And many did not wake again. In the early days of the plague, parents tried to shield their little ones. They closed the windows, washed their hands with herbs, told stories to distract them, sang lullabies by candlelight while worry tugged at the edge of every note. Some were lucky. Their children never saw what came. But most were not. The Black Death did not spare youth. It did not care for innocence. In town after town, the first signs would appear: a feverish forehead, a restless night, a sudden swelling in the neck of a child who had only just been chasing birds in the street that morning. Mothers wept. Fathers prayed. But there was little they could do. The sickness moved quickly. Too quickly. Children, their bodies still growing, often succumbed faster than adults. The fever took hold, the breath shortened, the skin paled. Some cried out. Some slept and never stirred. Others drifted into hallucinations, seeing things no one else could: lights in corners, voices in rafters, the faces of long-lost friends. In the cities, where death crowded close, children huddled in small beds beside siblings, unaware of the danger until it was too late. They played with dolls carved from wood, spun tops on dusty floors, drew with charcoal on the walls while outside, the wheels of the plague carts rattled by. Sometimes, they asked why it was so quiet, why the baker hadn't come, why the bells rang so often, why the priest no longer visited. Parents tried to answer. They said the baker had gone on a trip, that the bells meant someone had found peace, that the priest was busy helping others. And sometimes, when they could not lie, They simply said nothing at all. What words can describe the end of the world to someone who has just learned to speak? In the villages, where homes stood far apart, children noticed the changes more slowly. The cows were not milked. The dogs were restless. The bread did not rise. Sometimes they wandered outside, looking for their parents, and found only silence, or a stillness too heavy for them to understand. Some were found days later, sitting beside the body of a loved one, waiting. Some tried to care for younger siblings. They boiled water, as they had seen their mothers do. They spooned honey into parched mouths. They sang lullabies they barely remembered. And when the others passed, they stayed quiet, not knowing what else to do. In rare cases, they survived. Alone. A boy of 6 found shelter in an abandoned chapel, living off rainwater and dried apples from a forgotten root cellar. A girl, perhaps 8 or 9, wandered for days through fields, wearing a coat far too large for her and clutching a doll made from cloth and twine. When she was found, she did not speak. She simply stared at the fire and refused to let go of the doll. There were groups of children, too, bands of orphans drawn together by hunger and fear. They slept in barns, in alleyways, in the naves of ruined churches. They shared crusts of bread and stories passed down from older siblings. They feared the rats, the dark, the silence. They gave each other nicknames, invented games to distract themselves, counted stars and sang songs their mothers once hummed while combing their hair. These children saw things no child should see. Their eyes aged before their time. Some of them became caretakers, nursing the sick when no one else remained, lighting candles for the dead, covering bodies with sheets, even if their small hands trembled as they did so. Others wandered, from town to town, from door to door, searching for food, for shelter, for someone who might still be alive. Sometimes they were taken in. Sometimes they were turned away. A few found convents and monasteries that still had enough hands to feed them. Some disappeared into the woods, into ruins, into memory. And always, the plague followed. Even in cradles, it crept. There are stories of babies crying alone in houses where all else had gone still. Of infants wrapped in linens, left in baskets on church steps by mothers too ill to continue. Some were found. Some were not. Some died in silence. Some were cradled by strangers who could only hold them for a few hours before the fever claimed them too. But amid the sorrow, there were also traces of love. A mother, knowing the end was near, stitched a small cross into her daughter's cloak. A father carved a wooden toy with trembling hands and placed it beside his son's pillow before slipping into the darkness. A brother held his sister's hand until her breath stopped, and then stayed beside her until someone came. These small acts, these soft, human moments, glowed in the coldness of the plague years. They were almost invisible, but they mattered. They mattered deeply. There were also tales of resilience. Children who survived, who grew older in a changed world. They became the ones who remembered, who told stories of the time before, who spoke of their mothers' voices, their father's laughter, the markets, the songs, the smell of bread in the morning. They built new families, not always through blood, but through need. A 12-year-old boy in Florence became the head of a household, raising 2 younger siblings with the help of a kindly neighbor. A girl of 10 became a midwife by necessity, learning the rhythms of birth and death before she had reached adulthood. Some children learned to write so they could preserve names that would otherwise be forgotten. Others grew silent, spoke little, worked in fields or shops or homes with eyes that had seen too much. And some, when they were grown, still heard the bells, still woke in the night to the sound of carts, still feared the smell of herbs, still wept when they heard certain songs. They carried the plague with them, not in their blood, but in their memories. They did not speak often of what they had seen, but it lived in the spaces between their words, in the quiet pauses, in the way they looked at a winter sky or a child's face. The world they grew up in was different, emptier, but they filled it, piece by piece. They lit candles in homes that had been dark. They rebuilt the walls of towns that had crumbled. They planted seeds in fields left fallow. And from their grief, something tender began to grow again. Not joy, not at first, but something softer, something like beginning. Still, they never forgot, because some part of them was still that child in the corner of a quiet room, listening to the wind, waiting for a voice that never returned. And yet they lived. They lived in a time when so many did not. And that, in itself, was a kind of miracle. Chapter 13. When Death is Everywhere. There is a moment, after too much sorrow, when even grief falls quiet. At first, death brings noise. The weeping, the prayers, the gasps and the cries, the rush of footsteps through narrow streets, the tolling of bells, echoing into the dusk. But after enough bodies have fallen, after the carts have passed too many times, after too many doors have been marked and sealed, something shifts. The noise fades. Not because there is less suffering, but because the soul forgets how to feel it. By the year 1350, death was no longer a visitor. It was a resident. It lived in every village, every parish, every home. It had become part of the scenery, like the hills, or the rivers, or the trees. It no longer shocked, no longer surprised. It simply was. People stopped asking why. They stopped asking when will it end, because they no longer believed in answers. The question had become a circle, and the silence it left behind was deeper than any prayer. In some towns, the gravediggers no longer cried. Their hands worked the soil out of habit. Their backs bent. Their eyes stayed blank. They moved earth like men half asleep, like oxen plowing a field that would never bloom. They no longer asked who the dead were. They no longer looked for names. Only bodies. Only weight. Only the rhythm of the shovel. In the cities, shops stayed closed not from fear, but fatigue. The baker no longer feared contagion. His hands were too tired to knead. The priest no longer feared the next funeral. There were too many to schedule. And the people? They walked with eyes downcast, their steps slow, their voices muted. They spoke in short phrases, if at all. They no longer exchanged blessings on the street. They no longer asked after neighbors, because the answer was always the same. He is gone. She fell sick. They didn't make it. The markets, once bustling, became quiet lanes of shuffling feet. A few cabbages, a few eggs, a bottle of sour wine. No one haggled. No one joked. Every purchase was made with the soft knowledge that it might be a last. Even joy had grown brittle. People stopped singing. Dancing vanished. Weddings were postponed, then forgotten. There were no festivals, no feasts, no music drifting from windows. Only the occasional low hum, a lullaby sung to an empty cradle, a chant whispered through cracked lips, more habit than hope. The church bells, oh, the bells. At first, they had tolled for every death. One ring for each soul. But now, they tolled in waves, morning, noon, dusk, because no one could count anymore. Sometimes the ropes broke. Sometimes the bell itself cracked, having rung too long, too hard. And in some places, the bells simply stopped. They hung silent above cities that no longer looked up. Above graveyards with no more room. Above altars grown cold. In the countryside, farmers stopped planting. not because they feared the plague, but because they no longer believed in spring. What use was harvest in a world that no longer ate? What use were seeds in a world that did not wake? Some plowed anyway, their hands moving from memory. They tied their boots, hitched their oxen, dug furrows into soil that would never see the fruit of their labor. Because the motion, at least, still made sense. But hope had grown thin. Even the sky seemed muted, the sun dimmer, the stars more distant. Even the birds sang less, or perhaps people had just stopped listening. Children no longer played in the lanes. They sat on doorsteps, staring, or wandered, quiet as cats, through streets they barely remembered as joyful. They had become children of silence, raised on absence. Their lullabies were the creak of carts, the scrape of shovels, the cough behind a closed door. And yet, people still lived. Somehow. Meals were cooked, even if eaten in silence. Fires were lit, even if no one sat beside them. Wounds were wrapped, even if they would never heal. There were those who still tried to help, not with cures, not with sermons, but with presence. A woman who washed the feet of the sick, even if her own trembled. A monk who sat beside the dying and whispered prayers into their hair. A child who brought water to a stranger. These acts did not change the course of the plague. They did not stop the dying. But they softened the edge. They gave shape to the day. They reminded the world, if only briefly, that gentleness had not vanished completely. Still, numbness was the prevailing mood. A slow dulling of the soul. Not despair, exactly. Not grief. Just absence. The absence of feeling. Of fear. Of care. A man could step over a body in the street and not look down. A woman could close the eyes of her husband, then wash her hands and make bread. Not because they were cruel, but because to feel everything was to drown. The mind, in its quiet wisdom, began to protect itself. It stopped listening. It stopped reaching. It folded inward, like a flower in drought. The body kept moving, but the spirit paused. There were stories of towns where not a single tear was shed, not because no one was sad, but because the tears had long since dried. There were stories of men laughing at funerals, not in joy, but in madness. Stories of women who forgot the names of their children. Stories of priests who forgot the words to the Lord's Prayer. Stories of silence so deep that the wind seemed loud. In some monasteries, the monks ceased speaking altogether, not by vow, but by instinct. There was nothing left to say. Only breath. Only heartbeat. Only waiting. And yet, even in the numbness, something remained. Something small. Something buried beneath the dust and the dread. The spark. It flickered. Faint. But still there. Because even when death becomes common, even when it becomes the air, the sky, the earth beneath your feet, life remembers. The soul remembers. Not always with joy. Not always with music. But with motion. With ritual. With breath. The drawing of water from a well. The folding of a blanket. The lighting of a candle. The whisper of a name before sleep. In a world where death had taken everything, these small acts became sacred. And slowly, silently, they held the world together. Not in triumph, but in endurance. Chapter 14. The Last Wave. No storm lasts forever. Even the darkest night must, eventually, yield to morning. But when the Black Death finally began to loosen its grip, it did so without fanfare. There were no celebrations. No trumpets. No shouts of joy from church towers. The silence simply changed. It shifted. Softened. Not all at once, but slowly, like the fading of a bruise or the dimming of a flame. The wave that had rolled over Europe, sweeping away millions, began to recede. But even as it withdrew, it left deep scars in the soil and in the soul. By the early months of 1351, the plague had already taken what it came to take. Towns once filled with thousands now held only hundreds. Villages had vanished entirely, their names lost to the wind. In the cities, streets grew quieter not because death still walked them, but because few remained to fill them. And yet, the bodies stopped piling. The fevers came less often. The graveyards, while full, no longer overflowed. Something was shifting. Perhaps the fleas had lost their hosts. Perhaps enough had perished that there were no longer fresh souls to infect. Perhaps the seasons had changed. Or perhaps the shadow that had fallen so heavily across the world had simply chosen to move on. Whatever the reason, the dying slowed. And those who remained, the survivors, began to notice. A cart passed by with no bodies. A week went by without new graves. A child who coughed in the night woke up laughing in the morning. These signs were quiet, gentle,
Tentative.
and they were met with disbelief. People had seen false hopes before. Survivors had lit candles too early, only to bury more loved ones days later. So now, they waited. They watched. They whispered. But eventually, even whispers turned to words. The doors opened again. Not wide, not yet, but enough to let in light, to let in breath. The towns that still stood began to stir. Windows were cleaned. Fires lit once more in long cold hearths. Markets returned, small at first, a few baskets of apples, some dried fish, a jug of thin wine. No haggling, no shouting, just quiet commerce, offered by hands still marked with grief. In the countryside, farmers walked their fields again. They paused before overgrown furrows, bent down, ran their fingers through the soil. Some wept. Then, slowly, they began to sow. Not because they were certain, but because it was time. The earth, patient and waiting, received the seed without complaint. Children, those who remained, began to play again. At first, they were shy. Their games were cautious. Their laughter uncertain. But soon, it echoed once more down lanes that had forgotten the sound. And with it, something began to return. Not joy, exactly. Not yet. But motion. Color. Breath. The churches reopened their doors. Bells, silent for so long, were rehung and rung again. Not for death, but for mourning. The priests came back, thinner, quieter, but still there. They held services for those lost, sometimes for dozens, sometimes for hundreds, whispering names into a sky that had heard too many. The survivors looked around and saw a world both familiar and strange. A shopkeeper opened his stall and found that his competitors were gone. A teacher returned to her school and found only a few pupils waiting. A family gathered for supper, only to count more empty chairs than full ones. But they Saturday. They ate. They breathed. They continued. In some places, new friendships formed, born not from convenience, but from shared pain. Neighbors who had never spoken now helped one another rebuild roofs, replant gardens, relearn how to live. Communities reassembled like scattered puzzle pieces. Never quite whole. But still, something. Something worth keeping. Many wandered. From city to city. From farm to farm. Looking for others. Looking for meaning. Looking for signs that they were not alone. Some found cousins they hadn't seen in years. Others found strangers, and made new kin from shared firewood and silence. There were marriages, too, unexpected and sudden. Two survivors, standing beside a well, looking into each other's eyes and seeing someone who had also walked through the fire and come out the other side. There were births. Cries of new life echoing through homes that had known only loss. A child born where another had passed, not a replacement, but a reminder. A continuation. Even as life resumed, the memory remained. It lived in the empty pews of churches, in the cracked paint of abandoned doorways, in the names scratched into stone. It lived in the eyes of the old, who had buried too many, and in the stories the young would never stop hearing. They called it many things. The great mortality, the pestilence, the wrath. But none of these names could fully capture what had happened, because it had been more than a disease. It had been a dividing line in history, before and after. What came before had been one world. What came after was something else. People noticed it in small ways. The stars looked different. The days felt longer. The seasons came more slowly. But mostly, it was in themselves. They no longer feared the same things. No longer loved the same way. They carried their losses like stones in their pockets, not heavy enough to stop them, but never forgotten. Some turned more deeply to faith. They built chapels, wrote prayers, gave thanks with every sunrise. Others turned away from faith entirely. They had prayed, and still lost everything. Now they looked inward, or to the earth, or to nothing at all. The world became, for a time, quieter, wiser, more cautious. There was kindness, born of shared survival. There was suspicion, born of deep scars. And through it all, there was change. The peasants, fewer now, found their labor more valuable. The lords, mourning their lost tenants, were forced to offer better wages, more land, more freedom. The balance began to shift. Slowly, subtly, but inevitably. Art changed, too. Paintings grew darker. Music became deeper, more layered. Stories told by firelight spoke not just of kings and saints, but of farmers, widows, children. Those who had lived. Those who had died. Those who had remained. Time moved forward, as it always does. Years passed. The fields turned gold again. The rivers shimmered. The flowers bloomed. And yet, the Black Death never truly left. It lingered, not in the air, but in the bones, in the bloodlines, in the dreams. Some nights, an old man would wake from sleep, sure he had heard the cart. A woman would pause at her door, thinking she had seen a mask in the distance. A child would ask why the bell rings only once now, and not a dozen times each day. And someone would say, "Because the plague is over." And someone else, more quietly, would reply, "It never really is. Because some shadows remain, even when the sun returns." Chapter 15, Legacy and Silence. History does not always shout. Sometimes, it whispers. It lives in shadows, in softened voices, in the things we do not say, and in the stories we dare not forget. The Black Death was a storm unlike any before it. A darkness that stretched across years and nations. It took more than lives. It took laughter, language, music. It silenced generations. Entire family lines ended in a matter of days, their names erased not by time, but by absence. And yet, as always, something remained. When the dying ended, the world did not simply return to what it was. It could not. Too much had changed. Too many had vanished. But silence, in time, gave way to remembrance. In the years that followed the final wave of the Black Death, Europe stood quietly among its ruins and began, slowly, to take measure of what it had lost. Churchyards, once small, had become vast fields of stone. Many had no names, just markers, simple carvings, a date, a cross, a line that reads, "Pray for the soul." And sometimes, not even that. In towns where record keepers perished, no names were ever written down. Whole chapters of humanity faded into the soil without a trace. But the memory remained. The survivors carried it with them. They spoke of it in hushed tones, around hearths, by candlelight, when the nights were cold and long. They spoke not just of the plague, but of the year the sun felt distant, of the year the bells would not stop, of the silence that followed. They passed down the songs that were sung when the churches emptied. They described the masks, the carts, the rustle of linen over still bodies, the smell of rosemary, the weight of the world before it broke. For generations, children were taught to fear the rats, to respect the silence, to remember that death, once, had walked freely among the living. They built shrines in quiet places, wrote prayers into stone, hung charms from windows, not out of superstition, always, but from memory. Memory carried through the hands and hearts of those who had known the worst, and lived. In the centuries that followed, the Black Death faded from the streets, but it remained in the architecture of the soul. It shaped how people saw the world, how they understood time. Before the plague, many believed that life was a ladder, up toward God, toward order, toward understanding. After the plague, they saw it as a wheel, turning, sometimes rising, sometimes falling, sometimes breaking, and yet, always continuing. The plague left behind empty chairs, but also stronger voices. Those who had been silenced before, peasants, laborious, midwives, now had weight. With fewer hands to till the land, the value of labor rose. Serfs negotiated wages. Women stepped into roles they had once been barred from. Societies began to shift. Slowly, unevenly, but undeniably. Out of the quiet came change. The plague also left behind a fascination with death, and with life. Artists began to paint skulls in the corners of otherwise cheerful portraits. Writers spoke of the fragility of breath. Songs from the era often ended not in joy, but in solemn prayer. And yet, the art did not stop. The writing did not stop. People did not stop dreaming. They simply dreamed with more depth, with more reverence, with the knowledge that everything, even the brightest day, can vanish. But so too can the darkest night. And for many, that became a kind of sacred truth. They began to understand that life, in its brief flicker, was more precious than ever imagined. They wrote letters to the dead, built chapels in their memory. They said the names of the lost, even when no one remembered who they had been. Because in doing so, they wove the dead into the future. The plague did not end with a cure. It faded, as fires do, after everything has burned. And even then, it returned. In smaller waves. In distant years. But never again with the fury of its first arrival. It had made its mark. It had become part of us. And though the centuries rolled on, though kingdoms rose and fell, though new plagues came and went, that memory never left. Even today, in old cities, one can still find traces. A faded fresco, a scratched inscription, a street name once known for the dying, a bell tower rebuilt after the silence. Sometimes, you may see a crow perched on a rooftop and think of the masks. Sometimes, in a quiet churchyard, you'll feel the stillness and know it for what it is, a hush filled with names no longer spoken. And in that stillness, you might remember that once, the world paused. That once, breath was sacred. That once, Silence was full of meaning. The legacy of the Black Death is not just death. It is not just horror. It is not just loss. It is, perhaps above all, a reminder that even in the face of vast, inescapable suffering, we endure. We light candles. We plant seeds. We speak names. We rebuild. And when we do, we carry those who came before us, not as ghosts, but as quiet companions, as part of our breath, as part of our story, as part of the long, unbroken line of humanity that survives even the darkest night. So now, as you rest, think of them, the ones who came before, the ones who held hands in silence, who whispered prayers through masks, who watched the stars with tired eyes, and still believed morning would come. Let their memory rock you gently to sleep. Let their silence speak not of sorrow, but of strength. And may you, in your dreams, walk among them, not as strangers, but as kin. Sleep well. And remember, even the quietest souls leave echoes.